Sorry about that. There you go. That's better. Um, so for those of you who couldn't hear those first few minutes on YouTube, sorry about that. But yes, go ahead and ask those questions and put them in the chat, and I will get to them as they come in. But feel free to start throwing them out there, and I can always go back to them and take a look. All right, any questions out there? While I'm waiting for some questions, I was going to pull up something here. Doo-doo-doo-doo. No, that's not it. Sorry about that. Yes, I wanted to show some specific examples of some bad writing. Oh, and I have a question, so I'll get to that in just a moment. But let's take a look. Let's look at what bad writing might look like, because I like reading bad writing. Here, how about this? The man went across the beautiful, sparkling, and quiet lagoon, seeing a giant sea monster brushing against the boat. It just stood there, and he swam. Well, first of all, it should be sparkling, so let's fix that. The man went across the beautiful, sparkling, and quiet lagoon, seeing a giant sea monster brushing against a boat. It just stood there, and he swam. Now, there's so many problems with this. What are some of the problems that we see? Well, one is, well, who is the it? What is the it? Is the it the boat, the monster, the lagoon, or the man? Too many adjectives, right? When you say you have across the beautiful, sparkling, and quiet lagoon, that's a lot of things to just talk about one entity, the lagoon, one thing. It also is interesting that the lagoon is getting all of this attention when really you would think the sea monster might be more interesting. So the lagoon gets three adjectives: beautiful, sparkling, quiet. Meanwhile, the sea monster, it's just big, which seems a little strange. That seems like the wrong emphasis. And then when you have it just stood there and he swam, we also don't know who the he is who's swimming, the sea monster or the man. Because when it says went across, the beautiful, was he walking? Was he swimming? There's just a lot of vagueness in this. So not only is it poor writing, not very compelling to read, but it also doesn't even make complete coherent sense. So we need to be very careful about what we do in terms of the prose level writing. I think a lot of the questions I'm going to get are on the story side. So let us move over to my little doctor's office now that I have some questions, and let's start talking about them. All right, so what do we got? What are your thoughts about having characters having dialects in writing? Some of my readers love them, but others say it makes the book seem unbelievable. When you say unbelievable, I'm guessing that the dialects might seem far-fetched or unrealistic, I suppose. You're not actually emulating a real dialect from an actual accent that exists in real life. You're like making up one. Um, I would say the thing about dialects is they can be very annoying to read in a hurry, because it's just tedious reading things that are spelled out in weird spelling just to make you say it a certain way. And if you want the audience to like hear it in their head, so you like make sure it's all phonetic and it's not normal, like that can get very tedious. Now, granted, there's plenty of authors that do it and they pull it off and nobody seems to mind, but on the other hand, it's a little bit of a risky strategy. So what I generally recommend is you can kind of start out with that and you can back off. So you can say, the man whatever spoke, and you can was from a area, and let's say the area in your world, the people have an accent maybe instead of saying W's, they pronounce it with a V, you know. And so you just kind of start to spell it that way. I want to vava or whatever, and only do that like the first couple of times and then just back off, because what will happen is the audience will just start to realize, okay, that's how the character sounds, but to actually show it every time would be really annoying. Yeah, somebody mentioned sometimes they just say the person had a heavy accent. That's another way of doing it. um, then again, the reader can just hear it in their own head. It's not forced on them to have to read it syllabically. That could be really hard. Oh, somebody said that the author of Pygmalion had an effect that they're not going to write Eliza Doolittle phonetically because it's driving him mad. Yeah, exactly. Um, it's really important that the character has a weird accent because the characters can't understand them, then that maybe comes into a little bit more of a play where you might throw in those sort of things. But again, you have to be careful. It gets tedious in a hurry. I'm editing a scene from a few years ago and having trouble matching my past voice. Any advice? That's an interesting thing that could happen, right? Because as a writer, we develop different skills, we have different approaches to things. And yeah, if you try to patch it up with a past work, you might find out that you moved. I mean, I would say just like anything else, it depends on what you're going for, right? I'm guessing you want it to sound like your past voice because you're liking how it was going. So I guess you're just gonna have to really look at what you think changed and try to go on that line by line level to see where you're making those different word choices. And look at things like, sentence structure and, your use of adjectives and adverbs and things like that, because you're probably catching on to the fact that your writing style has changed. But I would think if you really analyzed it, you probably could go back and figure out how it's changed if you took the time to really study it. Now, you may find that that's not what you want to do, right? I mean, you could potentially just move it more towards your modern voice. And the other thing too is that might be a bias that you have, just because you're coming to the work. I know sometimes people can be, it's like when you add something to your house and it just really stands out, but to anybody else, it just blends in because they don't know any better. So you may want to try and see too, if you gave it to another reader, if they would be able to clearly identify what's new and what's not, because it might not be quite as obvious as you think. That might be your own bias coming in there. So just be careful with that. All right, so let's see. 20,000 words. Main character is about 5 years old. Is key component in the beginning of evil people to take over city. Other drama involved in plot, but this is a very basic premise. Evil people take over city. Come up with some plot where he saves the city from evil rule. I'm kind of. I have a question. I have a question about your statement there. I. What is your question? I mean, it's an interesting synopsis, but I'm trying to figure out what specifically you're looking for. Looking for help with something there. End of part one. Because it makes sense that you have a situation where. Oh, is this a good premise? Okay, so let me go back. Um, And so you're asking, is this a good premise? A 5-year-old is a key component in the beginning of evil people to take over city. I would need to know a little bit more about what that exactly means, because obviously a 5-year-old doesn't have a lot of agency. So I'm guessing they're not really at all responsible. There's just something about them. They have like a super ability, or they're a icon or something. And then the evil people take over the city, and then when they're older, he saves the city from evil rule. I mean, the idea that somebody that kind of is even not themselves responsible, but in a sense responsible, like, because obviously, like I said, 5-year-old's not super responsible for anything, but let's say that it's kind of their fault because maybe they had some sort of ability or something, and then they end up part of that system, and the system is taken over, and then they have to be the thing that kind of undermines the whole system. I think that's very interesting for a lot of levels. For one, you have that guilt and that driving force from the main character, even though it's not really their fault, but it's kind of it's kind of their a fault by proxy or something. I don't know how you would put it, but it's their fault, that this happened. But on the other hand, it seems like it would be very difficult for them to fix it, right? Because if they're at the root of the problem, if their abilities, if their image, whatever it was that helped this evil force take power is connected to them, then why would the opposing force really want to work with them either? So it's almost like you have a character that nobody likes, which of course is high stakes, high drama, high tension. So that's very interesting. And so I could see where, as a premise, at that very core level, sure, where it's going to rise and fall is in the details. But certainly, as a core conflict, the idea that somebody, through kind of no fault of their own, ended up aiding a horrific system and then is trying to rebel against the horrific system. Yeah, sure, why not? That's very basic, human drama. So I could see that working really well. Where it'll work or not is in those pesky details, but on a high level that makes a lot of sense. I actually really like too that you were able to break it down to such core elements, because that kind of tells you the sort of story it is, and maybe the way I was talking about it's not the way you're going to go down with it. It's not like a story about guilt. Maybe it's more of a story about the ignorance of youth, and as you get older you realize the crimes of either your parents or your heritage or your country or whatever, and you want to make amends. Maybe it's more of a story like that. There's lots of different themes, and you can, when you get down to brass tacks, when you can condense your story down to those core elements, you can really kind of get an idea of what is this story actually about. It may have, whatever, talking dragons or dolphins that play the tambourine or whatever, but that's not ultimately what it's going to be about, right? It's about something bigger than that. And so you can kind of have a sense of what it's about. Be careful that just because you know what your themes are of your story, you don't overdo it. You still tell a compelling story and all of that, and you still have fun with all of those elements. But it is helpful to know what's at the root of it, what's kind of driving the whole thing, especially with your character motivation, because character is going to drive the whole thing. And so this main character is a very compelling main character. But that makes me want to think about other characters surrounding this main character, right? Because where were the parents when he was 5? Was he abducted from his parents, or were his parents in cahoots with the whole system? Et cetera, et cetera. It'll help start to build a whole cast of people, and also whenever you have some sort of authoritarian dictatorship system kind of thing, you have an interesting spectrum of people. You have the people that are willing to work with it as best they can. They see the flaws. They maybe even realize it's horrible, but they're like, well, you know, I can still get something out of it, or I can still affect positive within it. There's other people that just want to burn everything down to the ground, and maybe even in an overly destructive way that's not even going to benefit anybody, because you have to be strategic about these sort of things. You can't just go through guns a-blazing, or the system might just perpetuate itself anyway because you'll get squashed. So there's a lot of interesting political intrigue and different approaches to how to solve a very complicated problem, because it is a very complicated problem. By the time you have an entrenched system that is, oppressing everybody, then how to get out of it is a challenge, always. All right, well, on that deep philosophical note, any other questions out there? I see the people on YouTube liked my answer, so thank you out there, YouTube. If anybody else out there on YouTube has questions, feel free to ask, and in here in our meeting as well. If we do not, I might just bring up another example of bad writing here. Hold on just a second. Let me get to it. Actually, before I do that, let's do a little bit of a discussion about the passive voice. Because the passive voice is something that I feel like is often not given quite enough talk. It's a little bit too vague. So when you talk about the passive voice, a lot of authors have this sort of reaction. And that's because they've been told never, ever, ever in a million years use the passive voice, right? Well, there's something kind of funny about that. Now, the passive voice, for those of you who don't know, is this is a construction that shows kind of the difference. In the active, the dog bit the man. In the passive, the man was bitten by the dog. It is a different order of words. And let's, for example, look at the elements of style. Use the active voice. The active voice is usually more direct and vigorous than the passive. Many a tame sentence can be made lively and emphatic by substituting a transitive in the active voice for some such perfunctory expression as there was or could be heard. The interesting thing about this, it's written in the passive voice while telling you not to use the passive voice. Or what about the passive voice is whenever possible used in preference to the active? Also written in the passive voice. So if the passive voice is so terrible, why do people use it to describe not to use the passive voice? Well, the answer is the order of words in a sentence does two things at once. It serves as code for meaning, who did what to whom, and it presents some bits of information to the reader before others. So early material tends to be the topic of the sentence. Later material tends to be the focal point of the sentence. And sentence and paragraphs violate this at their own peril. However, the passive voice allows you to convey who did what to whom, and you can start with the done to rather than the doer. Now, why would you want to do this? I'm going to give an example. A messenger arrives from Corinth. It emerges that he was formerly a shepherd on Mount Kithaeron, and during that time he was given a baby. The baby, he says, was given to him by another shepherd from the Laius household who had been told to get rid of the child. Now, this makes perfect sense. It's very clear, it's very straightforward, and look at all of these passive sentences. Yep, and that's because we're trying to track the object, right? So we have he was given a baby, and then we start the baby was given to him, and then who had been told. You're tracking the object, so you're talking about the done to rather than the doer. And so to adjust that sentence order makes sense. Imagine if we tried to adjust it. A messenger arrives from Corinth. It emerges that he was formerly a shepherd on Mount Kithaeron, and during that time someone gave him a baby. Another shepherd from the Laius household, he said, whom someone had told to get rid of the child, gave the baby to him. Yeah, this is not better at all, right? It is much, much worse. So this is kind of a quick down and dirty example as to why you don't always have to be scared of the passive voice. And that was a little riff off of my sci-fi class. So yeah, if you like those sort of tips, we do have a couple of classes coming up, and we go into the prose level just like that with more exercises, more examples. And I will I will be starting. I can parse words. I will be starting my fantasy class tomorrow, and Gareth will be starting his horror class tomorrow. All right, so I have a question. This person has a prologue and they were interested to see how it goes. All right. Something steely banged the back of my head. Behind my eyelids, a bright flash of light burst in the blackness. When I opened my eyes, I couldn't see a damn thing in the pitch-like darkness. I attempted to lift my hand, finding my arms pinned behind me and tied at the wrist made moving impossible. I laid on my back, contemplating the outcome. I smelled traces of a new car. I tumbled and jostled around in the trunk of a vehicle as it banged over a patch of road. The tires sizzled on wet pavements, and the roaring rain pelted the lid of the trunk. So okay, so it just keeps going and keeps going. Yeah, no, honestly, the idea of beginning a story with somebody who's been kidnapped, trying to figure out where they are, it's not like it's never been done before, but it is, so obviously it's a hook. I'm interested. One thing I like about the way that you wrote this too was you still got a sense of the voice of the character, the personality of the main character. So I'm very, I'm starting to kind of root for them. I kind of like the way that they talk, although maybe you could get a little bit more into that if you wanted to. But yeah, obviously you start with a bunch of questions, right? Why is this person in this situation? Why were they drugged and put in the back of a car? And things like that. So, uh, yeah, not a bad hook for sure. I will, uh, in terms of, let me go back. What was the exact question? You just said, is it effective enough? Yeah. Is it effective enough to want me to keep reading? Yes. Currently, yes. I will say though that I would want at least a hint as to what's going on fairly soon in terms of why they might be interested or something. I don't, and I'm not saying you're not going to do that, but um, I would be interested to have a more of a sense as to the situation this man has in. The passive voice is never to be used at all. Yes, exactly. No. Yes, that came from YouTube. All right. Any other questions before I wrap this up for today? Later on at 3 p.m. today, I will be doing my Book Blender, and Book Blender is where we do live improv storytelling. So I will be getting a random protagonist and villain and setting from my little blender. I have no idea what's going to happen. And I will try to come up with the story on the fly with the help of all of you as well. It's a lot of fun. Fun brainstorming activity. And the cool thing about it is that even though you start out with kind of a silly kind of combination, often I try to distill it down to the core elements and try to get something that's a little bit more of a what can we do with this sort of situation? Because, that's how brainstorming works. Brainstorming can start on this high, weird, ethereal level where it's like, I'm just going to say yes. That's the answer of brainstorming. Just say yes for a while. Just say yes, yes, yes to everything and see if it works. And then after a time, you can do what some people call the brain squeeze, which is where you take all those yeses and you figure out what's actually going to make sense. But for the time being, you start out and you're like, yeah, okay, that's the way it works. And yeah, okay, that works. And yes, and yes, and yes. And just keep building and building and building and building. So if you would like to check that out, if you're somebody that doesn't usually brainstorm, or you would like to just watch me attempt to brainstorm at 3 o'clock, I will be doing the Book Blender. In the meantime, thank you so much for joining me. I have a question. Woohoo! Just in the last moment. Do you have any advice for plotting a series, how to deal with open threads, etc.? Yes, the challenge with a series is not forgetting that every installment really does need to have a does need to be solid on its own, especially if you're writing in the traditional sense. Now, I know that there are people that will write things for, Amazon, for the self-publishing world, where they really start to become more like television episodes. Readers will either be okay with that or hate you for it. So really be careful before you dive into that sort of format. What I generally recommend is a more traditional concept, which is that every story should more or less stand on its own in terms of a beginning and the middle and an end. Even if there is leftover consequences. Two really great examples that are just very famous are Empire Strikes Back and Catching Fire. Uh, Empire Strikes Back in Star Wars does a great job of a cliffhanger, but yet that story did have a beginning, middle, and end where Luke went for training. He was told he had to face off with Vader, and he did face off with Vader. It ends up being a fail, but he did see him and survive. And you have the whole subplot with Han and Leia, and they get captured and they have to escape, and Han Solo ends up in Carbonite. But again, it's still they've gotten out of that situation. They're out of the Cloud City. They have to move on to their next adventure, but you still get a sense of a beginning, middle, and end. And they have the epic, Hoth battle at the beginning to kind of kick things off, and it's a much more quiet ending. It's well constructed. Catching Fire from the Hunger Games does this well also because it sets up the fact that there's going to be this event, and the event ends up I mean, I guess everybody's seen it, but um, the event comes to its conclusion, and then there's consequences because of the way that the people handled it. But you still have a beginning, middle, and end. There's a mystery about what's going on within the Hunger Games, that specific installment, and they figure out that. And, there's people that have to like sacrifice themselves, and people have to figure out, who's on what side, and all of that gets resolved. But it's just in the process of doing all of that, there are other dominoes that get triggered that result in, whoa, now what's going to happen, because they've just really changed the game. So I feel like series that do this well do something like that. They do an installment where you have the hero, and the hero has made some progress, even if they're not totally where they need to be at, and maybe even they end with a little bit of a failure, but they're still moving forward towards something. And you have a sense that they're further towards it than when they started, even if there are setbacks they have to deal with. And then the other thing is that within the work itself, within that story itself, there's often some sort of tension, like, can they get out of this situation? And then you fix that. Or what is the mystery behind this? And then you fix that. But that doesn't affect what is a bigger story. It's almost like, like Russian nesting dolls or something. You have to you have to think of the fact that within it needs to be contained, even if it's in a bigger thing that's also contained, if that makes sense. So, but generally speaking, especially with early writers, I would say rather than think towards a series, just think towards a book. Because sometimes what early writers will do is they just see so many series, and or they think, oh, well, my book has too many ideas to be a book. And that can be a problem, but what I often find is not that people have too many ideas in a book, but they don't have enough. And they are stretching something out that really could just be a book into a series. And that doesn't mean it can't be a series, but it may not be a series in the way you think, because the specific conflict that you're going to try to stretch out with like 5 books may just not be good enough. I'm reading what Ron sent me. He read me a little bit. All right, that's interesting. I will say, because this is what he says. As my brain fog began to lift, I wondered how I arrived at this particular state of affairs. It had only been a few days, but this wasn't entirely true, because this day had been coming for several years. Had I stuck around 16 years ago instead of running off like a wounded deer, this predicament could have been avoided. At any rate, I bolted, so now I suffer the consequences, and I couldn't blame anyone but myself. Youthful hope decisions based on emotions and hormones are usually off the mark. In this game, there would be no winner, only the loser and the sullied. Getting out of this jam is my immediate concern, and then to settle the long overdone score permanently. Now it's starting to feel a little bit telly, not showy to me. I'm feeling this a little navel gazy. I was more interested when it was, I'm stuck in a car, how do I get out? And now that you kind of took a step back and you're doing, well, I'm kind of owed this and all this. I mean, it's not, I haven't like lost complete interest, but you did lose me a little bit. I'm not sure if that's quite I see what you're trying to do, but I feel like you're spelling out a little bit too much. And also you have that immediate attention that's just interesting enough that I don't want to lose that pacing of the action where you literally have somebody locked in a car, and the desperation, and I'm thinking that they're going to start rattling off, all the different ways that they could potentially escape and what they're going to do next and all that. And even though, sure, they might be thinking, well, I had kind of had this coming, I don't know if a person would spend quite as much time as that. It feels a little bit writerly and not like I'm really in their head, if that makes sense. But I'm not trying to write your book, but that's just, I would say I would keep with attention. Anyway, thank you. Escape comes in the middle of the book. Oh, so is this whole book done as like a flashback to what got him to this point? Because if that's okay, because if that's the case, then I would say I'm not sure. Hmm. Yeah, I would have to see how that goes. Because my concern with that is it might feel a little bit too much then like your hook is just kind of a trick to get you to read. I would have to see what the flashback story is like, right? Because it starts out, it's like, oh, is this some kind of interesting adventure? It's almost like North by Northwest or something. But if this is something, you know what I mean? Like I would have to see where it's going from that standpoint as to whether or not that's a good hook for the type of story you're doing. Because it is interesting, but I just don't know if it's setting up the audience expectation correctly for what you're trying to do. So that being said, I will see you later for Book Blender, and I will see you around AutoCrit Live. Bye, everybody.